Hello, and welcome to the Trepa Technologies Security Plus course. My name is Johnny Bandon, and I will be your instructor for this video series. This video will cover Domain 1.7 security assessments. Now let's get started. An important part of every security program is to make sure your cybersecurity analysts are being proactive in finding threats and mitigating risks to the organization. Threat hunting is a concept used by teams to discover vulnerabilities, threat vectors, or even persistence on the network. Persistence being, because we have not gone over this yet, an APT or malicious threat actor or script currently residing, right? So finding those backdoors or those malicious connections. Now back to threat hunting. Right, threat hunting. The concept of threat hunting is simple in nature. Take on the mindset of an attacker, follow different advanced persistent threat patterns, and discover threats or vulnerabilities on the network. So in your enterprise, you could have a threat hunting team that maybe isn't their entire designation. Maybe they're part of the cyber team or the security team. And you pick individuals to do threat hunting, maybe on a quarterly basis, monthly, or however you want to implement threat hunting. Threat feeds are websites that list vulnerabilities for communities to subscribe to. Threat feeds can be completely open to the public, they can be paid for, or threat feeds can even be proprietary to an organization. The US government will have threat feeds that require special clearance. So if you have a top secret clearance in the government, you could potentially subscribe to threat feeds about our adversaries that the public could not. Cybersecurity professionals can also integrate threat feeds into their automation and response systems, which we'll go over later in this course. Our response systems being SIEM, our firewalls, IDS, IPS, right? All that stuff. You can integrate threat feeds into that. Cisco Talos is one threat feed that you can pay for that you can integrate into Cisco security hardware. And this will give your systems the most up-to-date information. Advisories and bulletins are very similar to threat feeds. They also there are also sites that list up-to-date vulnerabilities. They're just a little different in formatting, but essentially they're all the same thing, right? And then we have vulnerability scans. Vulnerability scans are used in organizations to create an inventory of all known security risks in the enterprise, so then you can remediate those vulnerabilities. We'll deep dive into the different vulnerability scans in the next few slides. So before we go over the scanning types, let's go over some of the different scanning flags. So it is important we know the different types of flags in scanning so we can better determine how to respond to security instances and to also better tune our security systems to report only positive incidents. So you don't want these false positives or these false negatives, right? You want to be able to tune your detective systems to give you only true positives, which is an actual threat or vulnerability. A false positive flag is when a system reports something malicious that's actually benign, so we don't want that. A false negative is when a system does not report malware or software that is acting malicious. And as security administrators, we can check this by going through the logs and noticing, oh, hey, our system didn't alert me about this. So again, we gotta want to tune our systems. And that's what log reviews are, right? Going in and actually reviewing our vulnerability scans and making sure that we're scanning correctly. Now let's start diving into the different vulnerability scanning types. Credential scans will give your team a more in-depth look into your systems by providing elevated privilege access. So what do we mean by this? So essentially we mean when we do a scan, we can actually go into administrative mode or privilege access, and we can get a more in-depth analysis of our systems we're scanning, right? So an administrator will run credential scans and use either shared credentials or a service credential, maybe you might use. That's a service credential. And these different credential types, again, we're going to go over later in the course. And credential scans can do more than just report back to you the different vulnerabilities on your systems or the ones that need patching. They can also do the patching for you, right? You can install different plugins that allow you to, on your scanning system, to patch something that it discovers on their systems, right? Sometimes these plugins you don't always want to configure, right? A credential scan can sometimes cause disruption because if you just let the system do its thing and it does an update on a Windows server that actually brings down a service, that's not a good day, right? So you can also do credential scans in read-only mode, which won't actually change anything on your environment. And then we have intrusive scans. Intrusive scans can also describe credential scanning. It's really any scan that could potentially make a change to your system that is called intrusive. The best practice, right, when you're doing an intrusive scan is really to sandbox your network. Try to replicate that servers you're going to scan and patch. Run it in a sandbox and see if services come down, right? That's the best way to test your intrusive scans. The non-intrusive scans will only show you vulnerabilities. They will not make any changes in production. And then scanning does not always have to be so broad, right? In our credential scans, we say, hey, I got this scanning application. It's going to go over the network and show me vulnerabilities and do some patching. And I have elevated privileges for it, right? But you can be more particular for the applications or systems you want to scan. We have different scanning types for that. So there are two different types of application scanning the Security Plus exam wants you to know about. So static and dynamic are going to be for applications, not necessarily the network devices or operating systems on your enterprise. Let's go over this. So static scanning starts at the very beginning of development. So static scanning is manually looking at an application source code and determining if there are any vulnerabilities within the code. See, we got a little caution flag there. So static scanning typically begins at the earliest stages of development, and it typically involves a senior developer. And usually there's a rule of two that we like to do with static scanning or when we're going over source code. And then we have dynamic scanning or dynamic analysis, as you're going to see it called later in this series. This takes fully finished code or an application and will scan for errors in a runtime environment. So what is a runtime environment? This means that your code, your application is finished and you've deployed it in some sort of environment. Doesn't mean it has to be production, could be the staging environment. For example, let's say you have just developed a whole new website for an organization and want to ensure that the login page has proper input validation, which we learned about earlier in this series, right? Very important thing to have. You can perform a dynamic analysis by putting that website in a sandbox environment and you do a cross-site scripting attack on it and see how the website responds. So dynamic scanning is seeing how the website responds to errors or injection attacks or you trying to cause known vulnerabilities or common vulnerabilities in websites, right? Or applications. So more scanning types, web application scanning. So web application scanning takes it a step further, and this will look for the typical web vulnerabilities and attacks. Very similar to dynamic analysis, and it is, right? But now we're talking more specific because dynamic analysis can be performed against applications and websites. Where web application scanning are scanners that are specifically made just for websites. So same thing. We're going to test how a website reacts in a runtime environment. And we're going to test against cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, SQL injections, LDAP injection, whatever kind of attacks, right? And we can even use tools like a fuzzing tool. What a fuzzing tool is an application or a security tool that involves throwing what I like to call the kitchen sink at your web application. A fuzzing tool will try to break and stress test your website to see how your website responds. So a fuzzing tool will do all this for you. An integer attack, right? A buffer overflow. Any sort of attack you can think of, a fuzzing tool will perform that for you and also do a stress test, right? Simulate tens of thousands of users going on your website. And then we have network scanning. So network scanning involves the whole enterprise or maybe just a subnet on your enterprise or network. Network scans will look for open ports and connections on your network to potentially discover some APTs that maybe have some persistence. They'll scan for standard ports that should be closed. So if you have port 21 open, telnet, right? Or is that port 23? I can't remember. Yes, telnet port 23. It'll look for that standard port so it can show you what needs to be closed. And there are multiple tools that we can use for network scanning. So Nessus, what you see down here, you're going to see this on the exam, or at least in the exam objectives, it talks about it. This is a standard scanning tool used for network scanning. Nmap, another open source tool we can use to look at IP addresses in your network and their TCP UDP connections. And then if you are interested in our bonus video series, we'll go over Nmap and how to use it. I'll show you how to use Nmap on a Windows computer on my home network and show you how it displays all the open connections in your system. All right, moving on to severity. So how do you judge the severity of a vulnerability or exploit? So a CVSS score, or the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, is an industry standard for assessing the severity of security vulnerabilities. So really what you got to know for the test is that 10 is the highest, 1 being the lowest. The Security Plus exam or the exam objectives don't specifically say you need to know how this scoring system works intimately. You just got to know what it is and how it scores CVEs. So each CVE, right, which again stands for Common Vulnerabilities and Exploits, will have a score next to it. And the higher the score, the more damaging that vulnerability is. And that score is a CVSS score. And then we have configuration reviews. This is something CompTIA wants you to know, just a concept, not necessarily a tool, that you should be reviewing your scanning configurations. You should be reviewing your operating systems to make sure they're hardened. Go through your configurations and make sure that they're how you want them, how they're tuned to help your enterprise. Then we have the syslog, or the system log. This is a running log on network devices that stores change notifications, errors, or other messages for you to view. So a network engineer can configure this syslog to different severity levels, determining what it wants to be stored and logged into the syslog. And then we have an SIEM. This is a security information and event management tool. So this is a physical device that can either sit in line or maybe off on a server somewhere that's going to perform log aggregation on your system. And it's going to give you up-to-date information on all the logs and everything in your network. So a popular SIEM tool I want to go over with you is something called Splunk. Now, I'm not a Splunk engineer, but in my day job, we use Splunk to do a lot of monitoring of our systems and to give us a lot of helpful information, along with log aggregation. So the enterprise I work in, we'll use Splunk and SIEM to display dashboards of information on our enterprise. An example of this is when we were doing our Windows version upgrade, we had 2 dashboards up in our NOC, our Network Operations Center, up on the big screen. One green dashboard showed us all the computers in our enterprise that were 21 Hotel 2 Windows version, which was the newest one at the time. Then we had a red dashboard that showed us all the systems that were 20 Hotel 2, an older version. Again, we would display these in our NOC, and we use this to track migration. And it also would detect us, or alert us, when computers have been changed. That dashboard was always updating itself. And we tuned it to about 24 hours, right? It would show us a new update. So this SIM appliance is great. You know, it collects data, performs packet captures, or does log aggregation on your network. and can display a lot of information for you. Then we have some more scanning types. We have user behavior analysis, which is going to allow us to create a standard or a baseline behavior for our users in our enterprise. And then we can integrate this user behavior analysis into our SIEM systems. This can help us alert, right, when we see behavior on our network that just isn't making sense. It's funky, right? And this can help us detect and be proactive against malicious threats before they occur. And then we have security monitoring, one of the implementations of SIEM hardware and software that gives us a display of information and security, kind of like I talked about in the last slide. All right, and the last thing we're going to go over is SOAR. That is secure orchestration, automation, and response. This is a tool we can use to automate incident response on our network. In our SOAR appliance or application that we implement, we can create something called playbooks. So we'll create playbooks that respond to a cyber incident that has already occurred on our network. So what do we mean by this? So let's say we already have an incident occurred, and we know that it may happen again because we're not able to patch that end-of-life system or whatever the case may be. But we can create a playbook in our SOAR system that allows us to automatically remediate that incident so that we don't have to manually do it. And this takes the burden away from our cybersecurity professionals, and now we can spend more time on other things in our network. So that's what SOAR is, the automation and response, and we do that in a workflow by creating playbooks. All right, so that is it for Domain 1.7 security assessments. Join us in our next video where we'll go over Domain 1.8, which will be our last domain in Domain 1, and that'll be going over penetration testing. Thank you for viewing.